Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your region, and welcome to today's Emergency in Central Africa, Impact and Insight, a conversation on the IPCC report and beyond. Bonjour et bienvenue à notre webinaire d'aujourd'hui sur...
Hello and welcome to our webinar today on the theme Climate Emergency in Central Africa. Conversation, what does the latest IPCC report says? I am Lancelot EOD and I am the regional communication agent for the IDRC, for the regional office for Western Africa in Dakar in Senegal. Before we begin, just let me give you some information on the platform that we're using today, so that you don't miss anything from the presentations and the panels, and that you can interact with the speakers. First, we have interpretation. So we offer simultaneous interpretation throughout the entire seminar. And if you already chose between French and English when you're registered, you can modify this choice at any time by pressing on the logo with on top at the top right of your screen, and you can choose the language of your choice in the parameters. Second, there will be a question and answer period during the event, and at any time you can submit your comments or questions to the panelists and the host. In order to do that, all you have to do is to press on the Slido icon on the top right of your screen, and the app will open in a new window. All you have to do is to type your question and to submit it to the speakers. You can also interact with the questions that are asked by the other participant by clicking on the thumb up button, or you can also vote for the questions. The question will then be moved to the front page and highlighted. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, click on the Help button, submit your problem, and you will receive immediate assistance via email to begin troubleshooting your issue. You can find on Slido John's email to send you questions. So I would like now to introduce to you Julie Prode, who is the Regional Director for Western Africa, for the opening remarks. Thank you, Laszlo. Hello, everyone. I am happy to be with you today for this important and timely discussion. It is clear that Western Africa is touched by climate change, the negative effects of climate change, including in the rain and the frequency of landslides and floods amplifies the vulnerability of population that are depending on rain agriculture and are affected by the conflicts. For natural resources management. It is the case for women and girls who have a disproportional burden to take care of their families. In this context, it is essential to discuss the impact of climate change in this region. Just to remind you, since 2006, the IDRC has invested over $180 million, including for climate change, including investments in Central Africa. We're trying to put the importance on adaptation measures and innovation. This process have elaborated politics and plans to increase resiliency of communities that are faced with climate shock, and to include social equity questions in climate action. The 2030 strategy of IDRC recognizes that inequities are obstacles to to attain the goals. And the response to these world problems are a priority. In order to show us the perspective, the African perspectives on the adaptation science, we have the IDRC has created the IPCC. And in the context of a 6 report on the in the African chapter. This work was supported by the work Adaptation to and Resiliency to Climate Change. This is a partnership between the IDRC and the Fine Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Today's dialogue gives you an opportunity to publish the conclusion of the 6th report and to show leadership of Western Africa when it comes to climate. In this session, we are hoping to highlight the key results, the key tendencies, and the emerging questions for Western Africa, and to show the gaps and define the priorities in terms of research and action in this region. We are lucky to have with us today a group of presenters and panelists to help us. I'd like to introduce you our key speaker, Dr. Aimant Totin, who is a lecturer at the Université Nationale d'Agriculture du Bénin and contributed to the reports of the IPCC. After his keynote speech, the other panelists will share with you their perspectives and comments. We have Mrs. Marguerite Nuzikenji, who is a sociologist and expert on gender and social issues. Mr. Gervais Ludovic Itsua, who is an expert in natural resource management and climate change, and also former Deputy Executive Secretary and Technical Coordinator of the Central African Forest Commission, the COMIFAC. And finally, Dr. Denis Roy, who is the main researcher at the Centre de Recherche International, CIFOR. Today's discussion will be hosted by Mr. Julien Chorwan, who is regional coordinator and editor for SAISDevNet and its francophone edition of Sub-Saharan Africa. So, Julien, the discussion is all. The floor is yours. Maybe we should get straight to Dr. Totin's presentation. It will be simpler. So, Dr. Totin, we have the slides ready for you, so the presentation can begin now. Thank you very much, Julie. And first and foremost, I would like to fundamentally recognize the work of IDRC, and it is my pleasure to present the main conclusions of the report on Central Africa. As you can see, can I see the slide, please? Africa is one of the continents with the lowest greenhouse gas emissions, but all its key development sectors are experiencing widespread losses and damage attributable to climate change in all of its development sectors. You can see also, when we speak about Africa, you can see all of the countries, and they are not contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. This is the comparison between Africa and Asia, and you can see what is really happening. Can I have the slide a little bit bigger on the screen, because it is a little bit difficult for me to read it. So we can see that overall the average and seasonal temperatures in Central Africa have increased since the 1960s. And it shows, thank you, Steve, it's a direct manifestation of climate change. Previous slide, please. We have seen that, thank you. Climate change has doubled the probability of heat waves. And what we have here is very specific to Central Africa. It says Central Africa, but it's also specific to all of the regions of Africa where the infrastructures and data collection have shown that it hinders the evaluation of the impacts of climate change. We have 1,200 meteorological stations over the continents, and 52% of them are not collecting data in real time. So it's difficult sometimes to have right information. So it's an obstacle to the quality of information that are contained in this chapter. We have the combined effects of the increase of temperature and the decrease of precipitations, which increases droughts, the risks of droughts in these parts of Africa. So here is the vulnerability of Africa. It comes from several factors. We can see that there is a lot of increasing urbanization in coastal areas, and people are living on spaces in inappropriate housing. The coastal areas, the floodplains and arid lands. We have these infrastructures that are not always built to withstand these climate events. So we are more exposed, and our communities have marginalized and vulnerable, and they have limited resources, so they are more exposed to the event, to climate change. So Africa is experiencing widespread losses and damages attributable to human-caused climate change in all sectors, in particular with on health. You can see the combined effect of the increase of temperatures and the decrease of precipitations. It creates the next slide, please. So these current climatic conditions in Central Africa are conducive to endemic malaria transmission. And the climate change reinforces social inequities. When we speak about healthcare, for example, very few people manage to have access to healthcare in our country. And with diseases that have become increasingly present, and they reinforce these inequalities. We have the most vulnerable people, they have people with low income, older people who are more exposed and cannot always face health problems. So we are missing healthcare infrastructures, and the most vulnerable people are those with congenital conditions like high blood pressure, and with the heat waves, it increases the impact on them. There are many people who are manual workers, who are we have people who are working on construction sites and who are constantly exposed to the problematic weather for most of the year, and they are more exposed and more vulnerable. So we are also looking at the next slide. So we are looking at food security in our agriculture. We've seen that there is some products like corn and yield, corn and wheat, for example. We've seen that the yield for corn decreased by almost 6% from 1974 to 2008, and the wheat yield also decreased by 2.3%. So everyone is talking about that, especially with the crisis in other parts of the world. The yield from 1974 to 2008 was close to the decrease by 2.3% with the wheat because of climate change. 2/3 of Africans perceive that agricultural production conditions have deteriorated over the past 10 years. Another problem we've seen, a lot of people didn't always explain this, don't know where these climate change events come from. They believe that we have agricultural and engineering practices, usually traditional, they think that traditional practices are not respected, but the effects are clear. The next problem is the access to water. Next slide, please. We have a combination of the increase of temperature and a decrease in precipitation. So it has bad impact. First, in terms of quantity. African cities are growing very fast, so the need for water is increasing, and there's not enough water to satisfy the needs. But there's also the quality of water that is affected because of these combined factors. So the result of that is that it has impacts on human health, but also on access to water, to drinkable water, but also for agriculture, especially in some regions in Northern Africa and Southern Africa, where agriculture is still irrigated. We can see visible impacts. I come from Benin, and at some parts of the year, you can see that the levels of water is decreasing. And this is the water that turns, that basically is necessary to produce electricity. So these are a few problems. Even though Africa is not contributing to greenhouse gases much, we still have an impact on economy. The report showed that when it comes to Africa, the GDP on average is 13.6% lower from 1991 to 2010 than it would have been if anthropogenic climate change had not occurred. And you can see the countries where the economy is impacted. In Central Africa, you have Chad, you have the RDC, you have the Republic of Congo, the Cameroon, the Gabon, and the Equatorial Guinea. So there was a decrease of almost 22%. So climate change is affecting all development sectors, and right now we are at a level of 1.1 centigrades and we see that above 1.5 degree, we're going to have more epidemics like dengue and yellow fever. We're going to have more disruptions to water availability, loss of biodiversity, and we know that above 2 degrees, there are some changes that cannot be reversed. We understand the decline in staple crop and corn yields, losses of more than 40% of pasture productivity, and the disappearance of more than 50% of freshwater fish. This is also this is one of the food that is the most needed. So this is the risks that we are exposed to, and Africa is in best interest of Africa if global warming has to stay around below 1.5 degree. Above that, adaptation measures won't be enough to offset the risks. So, talking about urgent need for action, we have seen that by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees, the GDP per capita is expected to increase by at least 5% by 2050 and by 10 to 20% by 2100. What does it mean? It means we have to act now. Action has to be now in all of the actions to support the efforts to maintain the global warming around 1.5 degrees. Where communities have always adapted. So we can ask, why this adaptation? Why do we have to worry so much? It's not that we have to worry, it's because the adaptation options are no longer enough. They remain fragmented and local, it's community actions. And there is the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge that existed. Our grandparents were relying on this knowledge to face the climate change. It's true. The problem is that knowledge is not articulated in the adaptation options, and it remains limited in specific regions. And our country have a tendency to have a version when we are facing disasters that is prepared. We can remember in 2008 there were many floods and there were emergency management programs that were put in place. So we are in a perspective of response, reacting instead of anticipation. So that remains isolated initiative, local initiatives as well, that are limited and not always coordinated within parameters that make adaptations options fragile, and we cannot effectively face adaptation. This is one of the questions that is often brought back in this report. How can we appreciate the adaptation options to have effective and feasible adaptation options? It led to develop different points in the. It comes back in different parts of the report where we tried to assess the effectiveness of the adaptation option based on several parameters, including economical parameters, environmental, social, institutional, technological, and it's the combined effect that allows us to measure the effectiveness. We have a tendency to replicate adaptation options because we know that it worked in a specific situation, and we believe that it's adaptable, that it's transferable, but it's not always true. We've done this analysis in all of Africa, and it's very important that we can look at different countries and even communities to see what are the measures that work, who could have the most effective adaptation options. I'll give you an example: human migration, which is one of the adaptation measures, and the communities are not migrating. This chapter highlights that the migration that is a response to climate change is not an international migration. These are people who will go from one region to another region of Africa because the land is more fertile, because climate seasons are not. There's not enough rain. For example, the precipitations are too low to allow for a good yield. Other option is the irrigation infrastructures, whether it's reservoirs, dams. They are very effective because it allows for diversification of activities, and it helps to face drought periods. So there are a few available adaptation options that are highlighted in the report, like early warning system, social protection programs, and risk disaster management, the diversification of agriculture and livelihoods, so that people don't rely on a single type of agriculture. We can do cereals and other things on the side. and also the diversification of the source of income, of the way that people are feeding themselves. People cannot rely strictly, how not to rely strictly on agriculture, but create small businesses and agroecological and conservation practices. So there are different practices that can mitigate climate change effects and can also better use water. So climate research in Africa faces severe constraints, including data constraints, as well as inequalities in funding and research leadership that reduce the capacity for adaptation. I will elaborate a little bit more in the next slide. So I was talking about the challenges, the main challenges to adaptation in Africa. So we have the accessibility to climate data, funding, and we have institutional problems. There are a large obstacle, challenge. So talking about funding mechanisms and how it is an important work for adaptation in Africa, we've seen that about 4% of global climate change research funding is dedicated to Africa. And a good share of this 4% of these resources to support research on climate change in Africa. It's institutions, international institutions, as opposed to Africans that are in charge. And so people are coming to do research in Africa. And one of the constraints that we have is availability of research on climate change that is not done by Africans, and that's one of the things that we're advocating for every time we can. How can we have mechanisms that will lead to a better African leadership? How can we strengthen this African leadership in funding management? There are several mechanisms. Accessing funds is not easy for many countries. We have a problem of time. It takes a long time, and there are several steps that can be very complicated. I was talking about climate infrastructures today in Africa, and we've seen that over 1,017 ground-based observation networks worldwide, only 10% are in Africa. And out of this 10%, 54% of the stations do not collect accurate real-time data. So improving education on climate change for many people, this representation of climate change is attributable. A lot of people think it's basically caused by the gods. And consequences are always attributed to something that is divine. So we need to build capacity also to allow the country to face much quickly rapid decision-making and to collaborate. The example that we give here is the management of the the coastal erosion, for example, where each country tends to stay in their own countries to solve the problem. And while one country is solving the problem, it's just moving the problem to its neighboring country. Next slide, please. So when we look at the table A, you can see that the stream of funding to support worldwide research in blue, and the orange graph shows what the money that actually ends on the continent is very low, and we can see in table D that shows you the top 10 countries that are in Africa that manage to retain some of these funds. Less than 20% of these funds are going to Kenya and South Africa. They are the two countries that are in terms of engagement of funding, they are the ones that will support adaptation initiative. Next slide, please.
The other thing which this slide allows us to see, I don't know if it's easy to read. We can see that the countries facing climate change or facing the difficulties connected to climate change are not necessarily those that are able to get the resources. There's a country like Mauritania, the Sahara, which uses approximately $1,800 million to support its initiatives aimed at adapting, and Mali, another country, uses about $775 million. We've got Niger, $776 million, but we've got Chad. And I indicated in the previous slide the influence of the climate change has on the economy of Chad, or a country like Sudan. If we look at Egypt, we can see a large part of the mobilization of resources for that country to support initiatives connected to climate change, almost $7 million. It's an enormous amount of money, even though if we see that it's a very small amount which is there to support the initiatives to adapt. And first, the countries that are most exposed are not necessarily the ones that get the funds. And that is something which I look to. Secondly, a number of countries have a tendency to support mitigation rather than adaptation measures. The dark violet, is adaptation. So the attenuation of the problems, more money is put than mitigation, than adaptation. So the next slide, if we look at the distribution of resources, we can see that Central Africa captures more resources than other parts of the world, and supporting resilience in Africa requires a combination of conditions. First of all, long-term planning, trans-frontier cooperation, not just Congo, which plans its adaptation, but it has to be done in cooperation with other countries. It's not because Chad or Congo or another PE is taking initiatives that the climate change problem is resolved. It's a collective approach. There's got to be a cross-border cooperation. The advantages must be spread equitably. The most marginal communities are the most vulnerable in that process. And it's very important that there be mechanism in place to reduce inequalities. And those are the final words of my presentation. I thank you for the IDRC for the initiative. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Totin, for your presentation. It's very interesting. Now, if I may invite our moderator today, Julien Chongwang, to take over to start the discussion with the various panelists. And Dr. Totin will stay with us because there may be questions that will be going your way. So, Julien, thank you, Julie. Thank you to the other panelists. I'm happy to be here. My name is Julien Chongwang. I'm the regional coordinator of the French language edition of SciDef.net, which is a online press spreading scientific information for development. So I want to indicate that on this panel, we've got Madame Marguerite Nzudi-Kenge, who's a sociologist and an expert in gender and social issues. She's from Kinshasa in RDC. Hello, ma'am. Ms. Kenge. Microphone. Hello, I'm Marguerite Nzuzi-Kenge. I'm a sociologist, as my colleague indicate. I'm expert in gender and social issues. I work at the Research Center in water resources in the Congo Basin. Good. In the panel, we also have Denis Songwa, who is a main researcher in the International Research Center in SIFA. He's normally based in Cameroon, but he's in line from Montpellier in France. Good day, sir. Hello, Julien. Finally, we've got Gervais Ludovic Itsua, who's an expert in natural resource management and climate change. He's also a focal point of the IPCC, who's the people in the experts on the climate change. He's also former Secretary of Technical Information for he's from Paris in France. Hello, Gervais. Hello, Julien. Hello, dear colleagues and participants for this afternoon. So we will get into the details of the subject, but I want to indicate that those people listening to us must be able to ask their questions in the channel which they will see on their screen. They can continue to ask their questions because after the discussion period with panelists, there will be a question and answer period from participants. So let's get into the details of the subject. So the question I asked to all panelists is, what draws your attention in the presentation that Edmond Totin has just given us? Ms. Marguerite Kenge, I start with you. Thank you very much, Gervais. Mr. Julien, regarding the presentation that we just saw, I would say that there is a problem, and it's a report which awakes us to the situation that we experience in Central Africa regarding climate change. First of all, I detected accessibility. There's a lot of vulnerability. The African population lives a difficult situation, and they're exposed to all the climate change. The governments are making efforts to see how they can resolve this issue. So there's a problem that I've noted. So there are options having to do with adaptation. What do we have as options? These options that were given to us here. There's also the local knowledge. There's a lot of experiences of local knowledge in communities because we work with communities, and this local knowledge, how can it be brought to a national level, and so that it can be a model for development to deal with the climate change? These are the 2 points I noted. We must make an effort to get out of this situation. Thank you, Ms. Kenge. Mr. Denis Songwa, what are you noting in this IPCC report that was given by, and you're in Central Africa? Thank you, Julien, and thank you to allow me to speak once again. Hello to those who are online with us. I think that Edmond gave us a report which allows us to understand the reality that we are living in Central Africa. But there's something that specifically marked. Central Africa, people are saying it's the Congo Basin, and here we see water, and we see water, and we see the forest. However, he's indicated that at this point in time where we are noting the vulnerability, there's water, which is an important issue. It's important to note that there's vulnerability where there's an absence of water. Hello, are you able to follow me? There's a background noise. Hello, Mr. Sawano? We will ask the other participants and anyone who is in the group, please keep your microphones off so that we can hear the other participants. So, Mr. Nsoa, please continue. So I was indicating that there's a sector that has been proposed, that of water. And when we're speaking of Central Africa, generally we see the Congo Basin, and we think of an excess of water. But at the same time, the northern part of Central Africa, where Chad, where we see that there is not enough water, and we can see that Chad and the RDC are affected as well by climate change. We can be affected by either an absence of water or too much of that resource. And it depends on our capacity to manage this resource so for us not to be vulnerable. And that is one point that I noted. A second point that I noted, what can be considered a double exposure for Central African countries. He indicated in his presentation that certainly there's climate, which is one factor or presents important factors affecting population, but we've got development conditions which are such that the populations are doubly exposed to vulnerability. So we've got a combined effect of climate and the conditions in which the populations are living. So these are 2 points that are very to be noted in Edmund's presentation. I can speak about other aspects later in the discussion. So thank you, Denis. So now I'm speaking to Gervais. What are you observing regarding the IPCC report? Microphone, sir. Thank you, Julien. Thank you, Edouard, for this presentation. And thank you as well for IDRC for this report on the Congo Basin and Central Africa. Thank you for this opportunity, and I hope it will not just remain a video, but there are many people that will be able to speak up directly, and it's not obvious that we've touched everything when we're online. So thank you, Edmund. I believe that Edmund gave us the report. What is obvious at first sight, because we are following the preparation of these reports and the participation. And you will observe that we are speaking of Central Africa, but all the exams are speaking about Africa in general, meaning that regarding our scientists, there is an issue to get the real data of the local context of Central Africa to be able to provide examples. Because if we are speaking of a specific region and we get into details, you are given the continent's data, it creates a problem, and we would like to have these real data. We know perfectly well that there is that problem of access or of aging infrastructure and available to data in Central Africa. But when we are basing ourselves on general information and we're trying to get the contextual information, there is an issue. I believe that to the extent, and I don't know whether Edmond was able to go outside of the report, but to the extent we've got to work on the resilience of our researchers, because there is that big question, why do we not find many researchers? It's an interesting question. In Julien's presentation, how many experts, how many scientists in Central Africa participated in this work or the preparation of this report? How did the research, the findings in our universities, in our research centers are considered and reflected in this report? So it is important, I believe, to note that and insist on the fact that we're not at all surprised by the data, especially when we're speaking of the means that are put in place regarding the fact that financing is not spread evenly. These are observations that are there and are worth being indicated. It is an issue that have to be considered, and the report did well in indicating this about how the resources were distributed. And that's my first comment before we get into details. Would you continue, Gervais? You raised a rather important point when we're speaking of Central Africa, but these data used are for Africa as a whole, and there are not many researchers in Central Africa. Does that create a problem as regarding credibility, reliability of this report on Central Africa? It is a problem because personally I prepare of countries and vulnerabilities. Observations are made that are found in the report, but there are realities and some local contexts which is not found here. And that is linked to the fact that a lot of the literature which exists, the people did not see it or was not visible by researchers working for the IPCC. And I think that's the big problem. Also, we've observed, I don't remember that when we were assessing and were validating the report for decision makers, the fifth report, there were 7 questions where the entire African area was noted as not sustaining impacts of the climate change. I remember this discussion, but this aspect had to be looked again because they were saying, well, we didn't find any literature that speaks of impact in your contact, so we could not take them into consideration. So we needed to have a political approach to include these aspects because we are experiencing the issues on the ground, and the entrepreneurs, the farmers are confronted by this question of climate issues. Will our university researchers, are they not publishing enough? And that is where we've got to make sure to use all the information that is there and make it public to encourage and have a plan of resilience for our researchers. Yes, I think that Denis and Edmond you're reacting on this question. Let's start with Denis. I think Julien raised a very good question, but it's simply to indicate that Gervais and I are co-authors of one chapter in the Congo Basin report. And we can see that in the sixth cycle of the IPCC on 600 researchers, there's one comment from Central Africa. And there are very few researchers in the region that are contributing. What we've got to underline is that the IPCC has a mechanism to recruit researchers that puts an accent on science, and there are certain standards that we try to use in the process. And in that process, we encourage, to the extent possible, the focal point, as Gervais and others indicated, to encourage so that the researcher can send their CV, can be part of a screening, and after that screening, we retain their CV. It's a heavy process, difficult process, but it's accepted by scientists. And once the report is produced, it's submitted to the focal points for the validation of the resume. We can come back to the recommendation. He spoke of the resilience of the researchers, but I did want to indicate what the reality is regarding the figures as to for Central Africa in this sixth cycle of the IPCC. So, Julien, up to you. And Edmund, did you want to add something? Thank you. Thank you very much, Julien. I believe that Julien has explained a few aspects of the procedure. So fundamentally, it's not the IPCC authors who produce the data. They come from literature, for large part, and literature that can be verified. He's indicated clearly it's peer-reviewed literature. So there may be some publications that are not considered, that we've not been able to see. But I also want to add that it's not because we come from a certain area that we bring the information from that locale. It's the quantity of information in the various indications. We've dealt with all parts of Africa, and we've got authors, contributors that come from everywhere. As soon as we know someone who has an expertise in a field, we deal with that person. We see we want you to be able to help us and we used more than 20 authors as contributors for this work. And it is true that there's been a lot of back and forth before getting this final effort after the focal points have been done. We open it to everyone so that everyone who wishes to contribute, to review the documents, can be involved. And then we share with the leaders, so we see that, well, maybe one aspect is not perfectly clear, and we do this back and forth. And this report, before it's published on a very well considered, and I'm happy that you raised that, because the validation was almost checked word by word. For one sentence, we can spend 1 hour. But the real problem we have in Africa is sometimes we don't have enough data. And I gave the example of the weather offices. We don't have enough. A large part of the weather data does not allow us to get real-time data. And these are things we can discuss later. So I just wanted to make this clarification. Thank you. Thank you. So we will move. There was a question for Ms. Kenge. She appears not to be online. So until she comes back, I will speak to Denis to see which role the agroforestry can play in the resilience and adaptation that we're talking about here. Thank you for that question. I believe that we indicated the importance of agriculture, and we saw on two crops, maize and wheat, and that these are subjected to certain effects, and he spoke of heat and drought. So agroforestry is a reality in Central Africa, and it's a practice which allows one to deal with a number of shocks. And that has to be underlined. In this case, we're dealing with climate change shock. In cases of climatic shock in the region, by practicing agroforestry, you can create an appropriate microclimate for the main crop that you are trying to manage. But Renman highlighted the fact that we can diversify the sources of revenue. He spoke of the revenue source diversification, and that works well for climate. What we observed, and I've also need to thank the IDRC, which financed one of the first projects on the adaptation in Central Africa, COFTA, and in the framework of this project, when we did the studies in Congo, MDCA, and Cameroon, when you've got different plants that are exposed to the climate, some may be more resistant than regular crops because these grasses can be more resistant. They can deal with the climate. So agroforestry has a role to play to reduce the shock, and that is what I can put forward as an element to answer your question. Julien, to you. Thank you. I now want to ask Mrs. Kenge, when you first spoke, you spoke of the question of considering local knowledge, and we know that during this knowledge, or a good part of this knowledge, it's in the hands of women. And is gender considered? Can it play an important role in resilience for these effects which are there in Central Africa? Thank you, Mr. Julien. The endogenous knowledge is very important in dealing with climate change. It's for the context of Africans. Why? Because there are women. They've been guardians of the traditional practices, and when you can see that women will speak to you, they are aware. They know that there's certain times, certain periods, there's been a change, and they can give the signs and the symbols. This year, we will have no production because these elements have happened in the forest or in certain locations. That's one element. If you ask them more details to deal with that, they will say, we apply this technique or this other technique. So women are resource people that looking at traditional elements, and they are there to support activities during this problems of climate change. And if once that experience is made aware to the institutional, the higher-ups, it can help innovation so that women and communities can continue to benefit from these traditional standards that are very important but not well known. So women are important in contributing to this adaptation of climate change in the rural environment. That's what I wanted to say.
Do you feel like your personal experience in your country and in your field, do you feel that today this fundamental place of women in when it comes to resilience is understood by the authorities who are in charge of this matter? So the understanding is very low because the woman is, the main experiment. The main activity is agriculture, and we know that today in agriculture is 80% of the activities, agricultural activities, are carried out by women. And these women are working with the communities, but with the government, there are some signs that the government is recognizing the contribution of women. The problem is that the women are very important in when it comes to resiliency. We have more social-cultural presenters problems. We have the division of work, for example. Today is the traditional division of work that is leading the activities with the groups and the villages and agriculture activities. And these activities are in conflict with the institutional programs when it comes to access to land. There is a bigger problem for access to land, where women do not have access to land. So the lands are managed by men. We were talking about agroforestry. It's an activity that is very good for women, but you need to have long-term organization. It's an obstacle, it's a challenge that is hindering the evolution of women's activities when it comes to adaptation to climate change. So I will say that still the authorities are catching up, but there is a lot of work to do because women tend to work in precarious conditions and do not have autonomy and access to land to really contribute in a positive way. This is the problem. Thank you, Marguerite. Gervais, you worked a lot on protected regions, especially in Central Africa. So can you tell us in a few words, what is the interest? What is the important things about this work when it comes to challenges to climate changes and resiliency and adaptation to climate changes in this region? Thank you for this question. It's true that we published about the Western Central protected zones. There was an innovative chapter on the contribution of protected regions in the fight against climate change as a solution. So we're not going to get into it too much, but I believe it's important to recognize that the forests in Central Africa are old-growth forests, and they are forests that have a really good potential to absorb carbon, especially just like the Southeast Asia and Amazonian forest. So the entire world today is involved in this fight against the climate change and global warming. We have to limit greenhouse emissions, carbon emissions, and we have in this region of the world, we have this political will has created a lot of protected regions, national parks. So the result is that it is advantageous for humanity to have these protected regions, because we already have regions that are devoted to research and conservation and the well-being of populations. So we've seen the description in the report, and all of the rural populations do not get their needs met. There is going to be a pressure on these protected areas, and we see all of these activities, herds, for example, that cannot find water anymore in Saharan zones. They cannot find grass to eat. So they move to these protected areas because they have to find food. So what we found in the report shows that, of course, protected areas have an important role. We can deny the role of these zones in the fight against climate change, but there is also the fact that these forests, these protected areas, are themselves subject to nefarious effects of climate change. And there is something to do in terms of, there is work to do in terms of management of these protected zones. Yeah. You're going to go into a protected zones management plan. They're going to talk about ecological monitoring. But it doesn't change the behavior of the protected zone when it comes to the evolution of precipitations and climate. It is limited because animals have to eat, and we've done a lot of work on that. So there was this recommendation for the necessity to allow these protected zones to continue to play a role for the advantage, the benefit of humanity. But these protected zones have to be, the people who are taking care of these zones must be trained, must be supervised, and we have to elaborate integration plans for protected zones on a daily basis in Central Africa. So Edmund mentioned it in his presentation. This is linked to access to resources. And you can see how these protected zones that have been created since 1934, it means that it contributes. It means that states are engaging resources to maintain them. They are paying staff, and sometimes they even lose their lives. But there is the fact that it is time now for the international community that are benefiting from the advantages of these protected zones to pay for the price of conserving these protected zones. We'll get back to it. Thank you. So we don't have a lot of time. We're going to move to the questions from the public. But before that, I'd like to go around the table one more time. We've seen in Mr. Totin's presentation that there were a lot of challenges. I counted 6: finances, governance, ecological, technological, human resources, social, cultural, political. So you all researchers with different specialties. So what are the priorities according to you? Because we have seen it. States don't have all of the necessary resources to face all these challenges at once. So according to you, what are the priorities, the priority challenges? I'll give you a few minutes each, and I'll start with Dennis. If we had to choose a priority, I will say interaction between politics and science. I say interaction between politics and science because why? Because we have here the presentation of an IPCC report, and it surveys the knowledge. And we realized that there is a deficit in terms of people who contributed to the process in the region. And it highlights the fact that even the people who are in charge, the decision makers, don't necessarily understand the question of climate. So there is a dialogue where scientists have to influence the decision makers. They have to understand the importance of science. But there is a challenge also, a mainstream challenge. We have to integrate all of the aspects of science in information, the capacity of people who are decision-making, people who can communicate, for example, also journalists. So there is this interface, science and society, that requires support. And I believe that decision makers and researchers have an important role to play. I'm going to stop there. Yes, we're running out of time slowly. So, Margarita, what should be the priority when it comes to challenges to tackle in order to succeed adaptation and resiliences to climate change in Central Africa? Microphone, please. I will say discrimination within the community, because it's part of the factors that are hindering this. We need women to be able to develop and effectively contribute. We need leadership in the climate change action. We need a deep study on the autonomy of women and girls. How can we bring the women to be more involved in the decision making? Because, for example, today there are lots of conferences, lots of activity, but the involvement of women is still low. So we thought about that, and in terms of the land as well, we have different conflicts in some zones, especially in the cross-border zones. There is a lot of conflicts, and it's always the woman who is feeling the effects, the violence against women, violence against people. And we need a deep, thorough study to understand the impact on women of climate change. It's very important to develop governance of women in these questions. These are the two main things that we found the most important, even though there is a good understanding there is in terms of the stakeholders. We understand that we have to work on equity and equality, and it has to become to be turned into actions based on the results of the studies. Thank you, Gervais. You are an expert in natural resources. What are the priorities in terms of challenges to be tackled for climate change and resiliency in Central Africa? I will say that there are people who are animated by the Holy Spirit have the same language. So I agree with what Dennis and Marguerite said. We have to add something. Everyone must feel responsible. In Central Africa, you will realize that the participation process is integrated in the rules, in the law. The state does not stop civil society to take actions. Sub-regional institutions are not preventing stakeholders to do something. Everyone has to feel responsible. When the state cannot access resources to share good practices, research centers, social society, they can access if we cannot have, if the government is not getting resources because of government's issues. So everyone, each individual must feel responsible and take the necessary actions. They shouldn't wait for a minister, a deputy minister, or politicians to do something. We are all responsible. This is what I wanted to say. Alors, thank you to all of you for this first round. Now, there are a lot of questions, and I'm going to go one after the other. The first question is, how did we get to establish the benchmark of 1.5 degrees when it comes to the temperatures globally? What it means for Central Africa? Can someone talk about that 1.5 degrees? I can say there are several scenarios that are experimented on based on evidence where we said 1.5, we have the 1.5, you have the 2 degrees to say that if we are in a context of there is only 2 degrees of global warming, what are the possible impacts on agriculture, on health, on resources, on biodiversity? So I believe that it's based on science, and when it comes the current warming, we are around 1.1 degrees. That's why we think that it's in our best interest when we see diseases and the current impacts. We know that if we go beyond 1.5 and even 2 degrees, there will be changes that are irreversible. There you go.
I can see Denis wants to add something, but I would like to add this at the same time as Denis answers the second question. But there are changes that are not climate change, deforestation in the Congo Basin. Is there a risk that focusing on climate change can draw attention away from other causes of degradation? So Denis could have the information to answer that question. Denis, sure. I would start by answer the first question, the more recent question. If we look at climate change, it should not move us away from the other issues, environmental issues that we have in Central Africa. This should be seen as an integrated issue because it was clearly indicated the climate and poverty issues and climate degradation can have a synergistic effect and a multiplying effect on the vulnerability of people or groups that are exposed. So how do we determine this 1.5 degrees? That's determined based on our ability, the capacity of the world's population to deal with issues or not. That was defined at Rio. If we've got an increase of 1.5 degrees prior to the industrial era, here is what is going to happen in terms of ability of the community to adapt. Once that has been indicated, we've got to be specific that 1.5 degrees is the average around the world. When we're speaking of the world average, there can be parts of the world we've got 2 degrees, others we might have less than 1.5. So Edmund can correct me if I'm wrong, but if we reach 1.5 degrees around the world, we'd be above 1.5. So it's in our best interest in Central Africa to consider these questions of adaptation and vulnerability and adapt to climate change, because while the world will be at 1.5, we in Central Africa, we run the risk of being above 1.5, and 1.5, that is a global average. I will not contradict you because I'm in a CFOC office. You're absolutely right. And we indicated that 1.5 degrees globally is not 1.5 degrees in Mali or in Mauritania or in Sudan. So there is a global figure, but these are community differences. 1.1, that is the present global value. The third question from the is language a barrier to getting monies. Are French-speaking countries not affected, or are there other factors that come into play? I can say that it's a real break to development, and in many areas we've noticed that. We've underlined it in the report when we're looking at access to certain mechanisms, when we ask that the language to submit documents be English. It's a real challenge in our countries. We can find people to prepare the countries in English, but in a country where we're speaking French, and we've got to make additional efforts to mobilize the expertise to transform a document in English. We're losing time. That's a real challenge, and that's the flexibility that should be introduced in the mechanism. So the impact that people has, they don't mind. They don't care whether it's in French or in English. The impacts that they have. Microphone. I can confirm that because when you're submitting something, first of all, there's the problem with information, because when it's English, the document may reach a little late, but when you're trying to understand a text in the local context, it becomes very difficult. It takes a lot of time. We don't have a lot of experts in climate change, and experts that would be able to do that in English. So these are local problems that create problems for civil society. There are even submissions that were rejected because they were not completed, because they don't know whether they wrote it properly or not. And that is a very important issue. And I believe it's one of the highest issues, whether we should give the opportunity for young experts. So it's the language of competition. We can't do, we've got pursuit training, and we've got to make sure that the documents also reach us in French. Thank you, Madam, for this precision. And the other point is, is there data available for regarding the funds that's distributed in countries? Are there country-to-country data indicating whether it's equitable? We tried to indicate the distribution between 2014, 2018 in African countries, and what is allowed for adaptation and what is there for mitigation. And we can easily get that information. As I was indicated on Slido, one of the big lessons, it's not the most exposed countries that get that fund, and that affects us. Thank you. Another question. How can we explain that Africa, which produces the least greenhouse gases, is most affected? And this question can be interpreted two ways: justice, climate justice, and the global climate. The fact that greenhouse gases are mixed and distributed across the world. And it's not an impact for Sudan only. What explains the fact that Africa, which produces the least greenhouse gases, the most important? Quite so. This indicates that the participant really spoke of the question of justice. It indicates yet again the importance of having concerted efforts. It's not because we produce less greenhouse gases that we will be less affected, or that we take measures within our country that we will have fewer effects. It's a global issue. The Africa produces fewer greenhouse gases because we're less industrialized. When we were looking at Asia and what I presented in other parts of the world, it is a question of social justice, and it is true that even though we emit fewer gases. We are affected because we've got a weak ability to, in terms of resilience, and we have to increase that capacity of resilience. We need adaptation programs cross-country, and our government systems have got to work together. Thank you, Edmond. Gervais, you wanted to chime in. Yes, absolutely. Edmond dealt that towards the end of his presentation. It's the capacity to react to climate change. That's got to be linked to the problems having to do with development. If we've got structures that can allow us to predict the climate, we can warn the population. There will be less rain during this season, so you may need to shift your planting by a month. We've got to make sure we don't have an obsolete system, and we need to work to put in place the networks and a climate information for the various players. And I saw an image in Edmond's presentation. We saw a point where water can be gotten. Do you see that if the infrastructure, the water infrastructure in countries had a good system, as we can see it in developed countries, would you see these images? No, because in fact, there is a problem having to do with development. I followed a participant asked a question regarding deforestation, but people need to develop. If that is what development is there, we've worked on these questions. Speaking of this notion of planned and unplanned deforestation to consider these development needs. And if you need to build a road to get to your village, you've got to cut the trees down. You are then creating climate change, but then the agricultural products need to be transferred. The banana will rot before it gets to destination. So it's got to be reasoned development. We've got very little time. There's one final question addressed to Marguerite. It's the question is to the effect, considering that the problems of the soil are is working on climate change is a problem for women, or an excuse for not working on historical problems. In fact, the access to soil is a long-standing problem, but it's a question to deal with. Women need resilience when they have access, when they're able to work on agroforestry. She will do it for more or less 25 years, and she's got diversity of food products and the ability to get more revenue. So it is important to promote the fact that women work with the community to have access to soil, and has more access than previously. One final question. When we're saying that Africa does not pollute a lot because it's not as industrialized, and Central Africa is heating up more than the in Central Africa, are the gases coming onto Central Africa? It's a good question to indicate. Unfortunately, we've got very little time. We've just got a few extra minutes. No, I think that this depends on many factors. It's not just the climate. I will not be able to give a precise answer because I don't know precisely, but it's a combination of several parameters. A participant was saying it's not just climate. We've got urbanization. We've got the rate of urbanization. We've got the population increase, and all of these factors combined could explain, I say could, because I don't know precisely why that part of Africa is warmer. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. No, just a minute. Can we have a few extra minutes, Denis? 1 minute, I think, would be appropriate. 1 minute. I think that Edmond answered well. If you've got a factor, one source of emissions. So, in function of climate situations or events that are specific to that area, if you've got a zone which is more sensitive, it can absorb the heat. It is clear then that you will have a greater heating in that area. So the biophysical parameters of every location contributes to the absorption of heat, which is radiating onto Earth. So in 1 minute, that is what we can say. So I will tell you something. You've got 15 seconds, so as not to frustrate you. It's as Denis was indicating. These are biophysical aspects of the African continent. For those that you look at the extent, the mass of the country, the air doesn't move like a train, like as if the area were smaller, and that has to be considered. So that all of this crossing of Africa brings us back to the fact that Africa is the widest continent in the world, and that works against Africa when we're dealing with concentration of greenhouse gases and the movement of air. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this discussion. We hope that it was useful and it was constructive, and that you found information that was important. We thank you for your attention. Julie, the final word is yours. Thank you very much, Julien. Obviously, there's a lot to be said, and it was a most important panel. We have reached a point where we thank our presenter, Raymond Totin, of the Marguerite Nzusi-Kenge, sociologist and expert on gender and social issues, Monsieur Gervais Ludovic Itsua, expert in natural resources and climate change, Dr. Ini Songwa, researcher in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you for your comments. It was an honor to have you here on this panel. We are really happy that you so generously accepted our information. Thank you, Julien, for sub-Saharan Africa. Your expertise in communication, this allowed us to have a great dialogue. So looking forward to meet you again. And thank you for all the colleagues and the IDRC who worked on this webinar, Micheline, Magloire, Mawa, and Marie. And thank you to you all, listeners, for your interest. We hope that this discussion and the recording of this webinar will be available online. Look at your YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Thank you, and have a good day.